Lecture 3.2, Formal Amendment of the Constitution. Our objectives in this section is to analyze the processes by which the United States Constitution can be changed and to evaluate the effectiveness of that process, and two, to understand the history of the 27 amendments of the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States has now been in force for more than 200 years, longer by far than the written Constitution of any other nation in the world. When the Constitution became effective in 1789, the United States was a small agricultural nation of fewer than 4 million people. That population was scattered for some 1,300 miles along the eastern edge of the continent. Travel and communication among the 13 states was limited to horseback and sailing ships. The new states struggled to stay alive in a generally hostile world. Today, more than 285 million people live in the United States. The now 50 states stretch across the continent and beyond, and the country also has many far-flung commitments. The United States is today the most powerful nation on earth, and its modern, highly industrialized and technological society has produced a standard of living that has long been the envy of the rest of the world. How has the Constitution, written in 1787, endured and kept up with that astonishing change and growth? The answer lies in this highly important fact. The United States Constitution of today is, and at the same time is not, the document of 1787. Many of its words are the same, and much of their meaning remains the same. But some of its words have been changed, some have been eliminated, and some have been added. And very importantly, the meanings of many of its provisions have been modified as well. The process of constitutional change, of modification and growth, has come about in two basic ways. One, by formal amendment, and two, by informal amendment. In this section, you will look at the first of them, the addition of formal amendments to the Constitution. The framers knew that even the wisest of constitution makers cannot build for all time. Thus, the Constitution provides for its own amendment, that is, for changes in its written words. Article 5 sets out two methods for the proposal and two methods for the ratification of constitutional amendments. So there are four possible methods of formal amendment, changes or additions that become part of the written language of the Constitution itself. The first method, an amendment may be proposed by a 2/3 vote in each House of Congress and be ratified by 3/4 of the state's legislatures. Today, 38 state legislatures must approve an amendment for it to become a part of the Constitution. 26 of the Constitution's 27 amendments were adopted in this manner. So most all amendments have been made through the federal proposal and state ratified method, first method. Second method. An amendment may be proposed by Congress and then ratified by conventions called for that purpose in 3/4 of the states. Only the 21st Amendment, added in 1933, was adopted in this way. Conventions were used to ratify the 21st Amendment largely because Congress felt that the convention's popularly elected delegates would be more likely to reflect public opinion on the question of repeal than would state legislators. The third method. An amendment may be proposed by a national convention called by Congress at the request of 2/3 of the state legislatures, today 34. As you can see, it must be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. To this point, Congress has not used such a convention. And the fourth method. An amendment may be proposed by national convention and ratified by conventions in 3/4 of the states. Remember that the Constitution itself was adopted in much the same way. Note that the formal amendment process emphasizes the federal character of the governmental system. Proposals take place at the national level, and ratification is a state-by-state matter. Also note that when the Constitution is amendment, that action represents the expression of the people's will. The people have spoken. Some criticize the practice of sending proposed amendments to the state legislatures rather than to ratifying conventions, especially because it permits a constitutional change without a clear-cut expression by the people. The critics point out that state legislators who do the ratifying are elected to office for a mix of reasons: party membership, name familiarity, their stand on such matters as taxes, schools, welfare programs, and a host of other things. They are almost never chosen because of their stand on a proposed amendment to the federal Constitution. On the other hand, the delegates to a ratifying convention would be chosen by the people on the basis of only one factor: a yes or no stand on the proposed amendment. The Supreme Court has held that a state cannot require an amendment proposed by Congress to be approved by a vote of the people of the state before it can be ratified by the state legislature. It made that ruling in Hawk v. Smith in 1920. However, a state legislature can call for an advisory vote by the people before it acts, as the court most recently held in Kimball v. Swackhammer in 1978. The Constitution places only one restriction on the subjects with which a proposed amendment may deal. Article 5 declares that, quote, "No state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate," end quote. When both houses of Congress pass a resolution proposing an amendment, Congress does not send it to the President to be signed or vetoed, though the Constitution would seem to require it. This is because when Congress proposes an amendment, it is not making law, it's not legislating. If a state rejects a proposed amendment, it is not forever bound by that action. It may later reconsider and ratify the proposal. Most constitutional scholars agree that the reverse is not true, however. Once a state has approved an amendment, that action is final and unchangeable. More than 10,000 joint resolutions calling for amendments to the Constitution have been proposed in Congress since 1789. Only 33 of them have been sent on to the states. Of those, only 27 have been finally ratified. One of the unratified amendments had been offered by Congress in 1789, along with 10 other proposals that became the Bill of Rights in 1791, and another that became the 27th Amendment in 1992. The unratified amendment of 1789 dealt with the distribution of seats in the House of Representatives. A second amendment, proposed in 1810, would have voided the citizenship of anyone accepting any foreign title or other honor. Another, in 1861, would have prohibited forever an amendment relating to slavery. A fourth, in 1924, was intended to empower Congress to regulate child labor. A fifth one, proclaiming the equal rights of women, the ERA, was proposed by Congress in 1972. It fell 3 states short of ratification and died in 1982. An amendment to give the District of Columbia seats in Congress was proposed in 1978. It died in 1985. Congress can place, quote, "a reasonable time limit," end quote, on the ratification process. This was decided in the case of Dillon versus Gloss in 1921. When Congress proposed the 18th Amendment in 1917, it set a 7-year deadline for its ratification. It has set a similar deadline for the ratification of each of the amendments, except the 19th, it has proposed since, although Congress granted the ERA a 3-year extension in 1979. The Constitution's 27 amendments are described in the table that you see here. As you review the amendments, note this important fact. As significant as they are, these 27 amendments have not in fact been responsible for the extraordinary vitality of the Constitution. That is to say, they have not been a major part of the process by which the Constitution has kept pace with more than 2 centuries of far-reaching change. The first 10 amendments were added to the Constitution less than 3 years after it became effective. They were proposed by the first session of the first Congress in 1789 and were ratified by the states in late 1791. Each of these amendments arose out of the controversy surrounding the ratification of the Constitution itself. Many people, including Thomas Jefferson, had agreed to support the Constitution only if a listing of the basic rights held by the people were added to it immediately. Collectively, the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. They set out the great constitutional guarantees of freedom of belief and expression, of freedom and security of the person, and of fair and equal treatment before the law. We shall consider these guarantees at some length later in the course. The 10th Amendment does not deal with civil rights as such. Rather, it spells out the concept of reserved powers in the federal system. Each of the other amendments that has been added to the Constitution over the past 200 years also grew out of some particular and often interesting set of circumstances. For example, the 11th Amendment declares that no state may be sued in the federal courts by a citizen of another state or by a citizen of any foreign state. It was proposed by Congress in 1794 and ratified in 1795 after the state of Georgia had lost in the case of before the United States Supreme Court. The case, Chisholm versus Georgia, decided by the court in 1793, had been brought to the brand new federal court system by a man who lived in South Carolina. The 12th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1804 after the Electoral College had failed to produce a winner in the presidential election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States in 1801, but only after a long, bitter fight in the House of Representatives. The 13th Amendment, added in 1865, provides another example. It abolished slavery in the United States and was a direct result of the Civil War. So too were the 14th Amendment on citizenship in 1868 and the 15th Amendment on the right to vote in 1870. As you can see in the chart, the 18th Amendment established a nationwide prohibition of alcohol and was ratified in 1919. What came to be known as, quote, the Noble Experiment, end quote, lasted fewer than 14 years. The 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. The 22nd Amendment in 1951 was proposed in 1947, and soon after the Republican Party had gained control of Congress for the first time in 16 years. Over that period, Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, had won the presidency 4 times. The 26th Amendment was added in 1971. It lowered the voting age to 18 in all elections in the United States. Many of those who backed the amendment began to work for its passage during World War II, with the argument, old enough to fight, old enough to vote. Its ratification was spurred by the war in Vietnam. The most recent amendment, the 27th, was among the first to be offered by Congress. This amendment forbids members of Congress from raising their own pay during that term. It was proposed in 1789 and ratified nearly 203 years later in 1992.